Really happy that you're here. You're here to join us. And a warm welcome also to all of our guest panelists and speakers and people behind the scene. Hello, everybody. My name is Denise Peck, and I'm the co-president of the GSB Asian Alumni Chapter. Along with chapter co-president Chris Lowe, I'd like to welcome everyone to our event this evening. As we get started, I'd like to draw your attention to a single question Zoom poll that is up and running right now and ask that you take the time to answer and submit your response. I'd also like to note, as you have already seen on the screen, that we're recording the session today, but all the polls will be anonymous and the chats and any breakout room activities will not be recorded. For those of you who are not familiar with our community, the GSB Asian Alumni Chapter is a network of GSB alumni of Pan-Asian ethnicities and or affinity, East Asian, South Asian, and Southeast Asian, with graduates of the MBA, MSX Sloan, PhD, and SCP program. Our goal is to develop a global community of GSB alumni to provide mutual inspiration, learning, and support, visible leadership, and solidarity around issues of common interest, such as showcasing career success in different industries, countering the Asian glass ceiling in corporate America, parenting with cross-cultural Asian values, and of course, just having fun together. Exactly 1 year ago, in the aftermath of the tragic Atlanta spa shootings, our chapter held a virtual event like this one tonight for our community and allies to come together to have a safe space to share our feelings of shock, sadness, and outrage over the rise of anti-Asian assaults and incidents. Sadly, since then, anti-Asian incidents are still happening, but we have also seen many in the Asian community rising and becoming more vocal and visible about the bias, discrimination, and assaults as a result of who we are and the stereotypes about us. Tonight's session will cover the impact of stereotypes on our community. We will learn about covering, the tendency to downplay aspects of our cultural identity in order to fit in, and some strategies to deal with this. We will learn about skills to empower us and others to address bias and to advocate for inclusivity, continue our learning, and gain influence in areas that are important to us. With that, let me introduce tonight's speakers. It is our pleasure to welcome Lori Nishiura Mackenzie, our guest speaker and somebody I greatly admire. She will share strategies and skills for empowering us to be more authentic and courageous in our personal and professional interactions and to promote understanding and inclusiveness at work and in our communities. Lori is lead strategist for diversity, equity, and inclusion at Stanford Graduate School of Business and co-founder of the new Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. At Stanford, Lori is fostering new research in the area of leadership, inclusion, and diversity. She is a keynote speaker to a wide range of audiences, from executive teams to women's summits, and was featured as one of BBC's 100 Women of Inspiration and Influence in 2017. She has an MBA from the Wharton School of Business and a BA in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. Dion Chen, our host for tonight's program, is an alumna from the MBA class of 1990 and currently serves as a business and educational consultant. Dion is on the leadership team of the GSB Asian Alumni Chapter, and this year is spearheading new DEI initiatives such as tonight's program. And finally, Adrian Kwok from our MBA class of 2016 will serve as a Q&A moderator. Adrian is an associate partner at McKinsey, as well as founder and co-leader of McKinsey's Asian Employee Resource Group. So before we proceed with the program, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Kathleen Lehman and Ramon Esquivel of the Alumni Relations staff and my co-president Chris Lowe for their support of tonight's program. So for those of you who just joined, I want to call attention to the fact that we're still running a one-question Zoom poll. So if you haven't done so now, please take a few seconds to take this poll and submit your response. We will now be closing the poll in another 30 seconds, and we'll share the poll results soon. With that, let me turn it over to Dion.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The question, what does it mean to show up as Asian in our multicultural world? And how can we act and speak with greater confidence, curiosity, pride, and choices? These are complicated and important questions that often can feel uncomfortable and uncertain. Questions we don't often talk about with others and even amongst ourselves. Our hope tonight is that each of us can come away with actionable strategies and skills that will improve our understanding of ourselves and others, and importantly, empower us to act, to contribute more fully, and to advocate for ourselves and others. Here's what to expect tonight. Shortly, Lori will provide insights regarding the challenges facing Asian Pacific Islanders and actions that we can each take and contribute to change. Following Lori's remarks, I'll be hosting a fireside chat with her. And of course, then I'd like to give everyone an opportunity to share their thoughts. Adrian will be our Q&A moderator. We'll end the hour with a summary of some of the takeaways from this evening and invite everyone to stay to continue for another 30 minutes where we'll have more Q&A and small group breakouts. Now, before I turn it over to Lori, we'd like to share the results of our poll. And thank you again. So, how comfortable do you feel about speaking about race and ethnicity with people who do not share your race or background? I'm glad to hear that almost 20% feel very comfortable, but then the majority of us, less so. So I think this is the perfect segue to Lori's remarks, and over to you, Lori.
Thank you so much, Dion and Denise and Chris and Kathleen and Adrian for setting up this important conversation and hoping that it is indeed going to be that we have a great conversation where we learn from one another. I'm excited to share some thoughts to kick it off. I think of them more like spark plugs for our conversation, and then we'll see where we go tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Our idea tonight was to talk about strategies, talk about why we need the strategies and strategies that we can use as individuals for our own work and engagement, and strategies that we can use as organizational leaders. And there'll be time for conversation so that we can learn what strategies you're using in your work as well. So when I was talking to the group about what the short presentation should be, I was reminded of the work of Deborah Rohde, the late Deborah Rohde, who was a professor in the law school, a very, very important thinker in the realm of women's leadership. And she wrote a paper called Women Professionals, the No Problem Problem. And I really liked that framework. What she meant by the framework was that it seems to be the kind of topic where people don't think there's a problem. Look, we have a woman vice president. Look, we have some women CEOs. Women out-earn men in every degree, bachelor's, master's, PhD. What is the problem? I feel in a similar way that Asians face a similar no problem problem. I remember when I first joined a group at Stanford, and we were talking about underrepresented minorities, and I started sharing, and someone turned to me and said, "You are not from an underrepresented minority." And I was taken aback because I had just brought myself into that conversation. And what they meant was that given the percent of the population, my representation at Stanford is not underrepresented. And yet when I looked at leadership and looked at who was leading the organization, I did see underrepresentation. So in a similar way to women's leadership, Asian leadership is where we can see how these stereotypical dynamics play out. And it brings me to the good work that our own Denise Peck has worked on, this idea that there's very strong representation of Asians in professional work. So this is a chart of the technology sector. You could probably see it in many other professional sectors as well, that the percent of Asians of the total population is quite strong. But the issue comes when we look at promotions to manager to executive. In fact, there's new research that came out by a professor at Stanford looking at people's experience. And in many ways, Asian women have one of the most troubling experiences in the workplace. So what is it about this no problem that affects us and everyone who identifies as part of the AAPI community and our allies? Well, it comes down to what I think is, it's really hard to affect positive change when everyone perceives there being no problem. So in part, our willingness to express what doesn't work is part of the solution in thinking about how to motivate change by helping our organizations and even for ourselves to see how we can speak about that in ways that compels more change for everyone in our organizations. So there's two sides of the coin that I think of. There's both acknowledging and advocating. For many of us, it might be deepening our ability to acknowledge the bind we might live in as professionals, Asian professionals, people who identify as Asian and professionals in many workplaces, to look beyond our own success and start to wonder what these constraints might be that if we identified, we could then work on creating change. And then what is our collective opportunity to bubble up those insights into collective action? This is a picture of the Asian Staff Forum here on the Stanford campus. So how do we think about both awakening our own understanding in order to activate our collective action? And this brings me to, I don't know if you saw this op-ed that was written by John Cho right in the midst of the peak a year ago during the peak of the visibility of AAPI hate. And what he said was that this coronavirus reminds us that our sense of belonging is conditional. So why focus on this? Because clearly everyone here is very successful. Well, I was in a group once and I shared that there's been a lot of work done with artificial intelligence on campus, including some research that looks at historical biases in the use of language. So interestingly, even though we're trying to weed out bias in the current use of artificial intelligence or AI, if you look at it historically, you can see some of the trends of who was discriminated against and how it played out. So if you look at what was words associated with Asians, say 70 years ago, it was words like sneaky, right, or devious. And the words currently associated with Asians in the media and other ways that Asians have public representation, there's more of the model minority stereotype. And I shared this with a group that there's been this evolution of the stereotypical views of Asians in our country. And a woman said to me, well, isn't it better to be viewed as a model minority than as devious? And my answer was, actually, I would like to have the freedom to be accepted behaving in any way. And what the model minority stereotype does is it masks the constraints that many of us experience at work, but often don't recognize or give voice to. What it takes to move beyond these constraints is what I would say is a combination of a growth mindset and courage. So if you know a big conference called the Grace Hopper Celebration of Women, it's a huge event. When it was in person, there are 21,000 women technologists who would gather once a year to celebrate, gain insights, and work together to make sure women technologists got great jobs. For the very first time at the 2014 Grace Hopper, I was there in the audience, Satya Nadella was invited in as a man to speak to this audience. So it was a big experiment. he was very excited to be there. You could just see it on his face. He was in conversation with Maria Klawe, who was at that time president of Harvey Mudd College. She was on the board of Microsoft. They were having a conversation. He starts talking about the pay gap. He goes off script. He thinks about his own experience as an immigrant. He's so grateful to have come to this country to become the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world. And when asked about the pay gap, he starts talking about karma. Don't worry. Don't worry so much about your pay. It'll come back to you. It's a matter of karma. What he didn't realize he was saying was that the gender gap in pay was a matter of karma. And the explosion was huge, global, and immediate. Now, the reason why I love this article is Maria Klawe said that that was one of the best things that ever happened to him, because he saw that a fixed mindset about things, not being curious, was part of the limitations, not only for himself as a leader, but for Microsoft overall. And that became the transformation of Microsoft. So for us to see our conditional acceptance, to view it with courage, and to have this growth mindset that perhaps we can move beyond that and be free to act in any way as leaders. That is the legacy I hope to leave my children. So what does it take to truly acknowledge this conditional experience that we live in? I'd love to draw from the work of Kenji Yoshino at NYU. He's a fabulous person. He is a civil laws expert, civil liberties expert. He wrote a book called Covering. And covering is a really interesting idea from sociology. But what Kenji did was he deepened that idea to see if he could help people navigate this demand. So the demand, as he expressed it, was he is an out gay lawyer, and his hiring department hired him this way. But then a colleague took him aside to talk to him and said, you know, Kenji, it's fine that you are gay, but just don't, you don't need to study gay legal issues. And Kenji needed a word for that. They knew he was gay, and yet they were asking him not to be too gay. And that dynamic, he pulled a sociological term called covering. I cannot hide that I am a middle-aged Asian woman, but I could background elements of my identity to fit in better. Now, here's the thing, not everyone has to do that. So this act of covering is indeed something proactive that people have to do in an environment where they get a sense that something about who they are is disfavored. So, I noticed the fourth column is missing, but it'll come up. So Kenji is also very literary, so he came up with this alliteration. I find it sometimes challenging to remember what each one means, but it's more important to take away these elements as helping you diagnose it as opposed to remembering them perfectly. So appearance covering is when you could change an element of your appearance. So for example, we were talking about what color we're wearing. Red is often most associated with Asians. So if I go to a meeting, do I choose not to wear red that one time in case I really want to have a different sort of presence in the meeting? That's an element of covering. It might also be selecting a hairstyle. For a while, there's a really famous newscaster named Wendy Takuda, and she had a certain hairstyle. And if any Asian wore it, everyone would say that you would look like her. So would I intentionally change my hairstyle so not to evoke that image? Affiliation would be downplaying your cultural or personal connections. So it might be, for example, if I go to the Obon Festival, which is a fall harvest festival in the Japanese culture, if I go to one weekend, do I not share about it when I go to work and talk only about perhaps going to a movie? Advocacy would be not advocating on behalf of someone from your group. So for example, if you're in an elevator and you hear someone say something really negative, I was in one group, for example, that was talking about those Chinese and he was very rabid, and I had a choice. Do I speak up or do I just ignore it? So I spoke up. I said, excuse me, there is no the Chinese. And the way you're speaking about a very large population, like a monolith. And I wonder if you want to break it down, because I find what you're saying feels very aggressive, right? So I don't know if I'm blushing now, but it took a lot for me to be able to say something in that moment. Do we advocate on behalf of people from our community? And the last one, sorry, it popped up weird, is association. So imagine you're in a boardroom for the first time and you walk in and there's 4 seats open, one next to an Asian board member, and the rest are people from different affiliations and races. Do you go sit next to the Asian, or do you pause and not do that? It turns out Kenji joined with Christy Smith from Deloitte to do a large scale survey, the degree to which people cover at work. And it turns out 61% of people have indeed covered at work, including straight white men. And in their study, they have quotes for how the Asian professionals covered in their organization. And if you would just take a note that if you've ever done one, I'm going to do a quick poll and ask you if you have ever experienced any of these demands to cover or to background part of yours. So in terms of appearance, this is the quote from the study. To overcome for Asian stereotypes, and we were even commenting, like, notice the wording's a little bit odd and how it evokes like a desire for us to correct it. Again, is that part of covering? I don't know. To overcome for Asian stereotypes, I do my best to speak up, speak clearly, and hold myself in a confident manner. Can you hear the work that does to never slouch and be able to relax and kind of be oneself, to always feel the need to perform a certain archetype? Affiliation. I try to stay away from work that is stereotypical of Asians, for example, math. So if there are people, I remember in my study group at business school, people wanted to be in my statistics study group, but I was like, ha, 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 if you only knew. But of course, here I am, right? An Asian who studied economics, of course, that would be an association. So the question is, would I lean into that or move away from it in the work I do? Here's one. Even though I am of Chinese descent, I would never correct people if they make jokes or comments about Asian stereotypes. So, you know, with things like what's happening on the media, do we ever stop these harmless banters that we hear around our organizations? Because they're not harmless. In fact, we have a postdoc who's studying the harm of these harmless competency microaggressions. Oops. And lastly, another quote from the study about association. I don't want people to define me as Asian. Again, if there was complete freedom in being Asian, what would there be to define, right? So I've been hesitant to participate in activities geared toward the Asian community. So kind of blocking ourselves off a bit to avoid this association. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share in chat a link you can click on, and I'd love for you just to comment. You can also go ahead and pull up any browser and enter menti.com and then by hand enter in that number, but I find it easier to do the link. So it's a different kind of poll where it just asks you, how often have you covered in this dimension: appearance, affiliation, advocacy, association? If you go ahead and enter that. And if you have any challenges getting on the poll, let me know. And the good news is we're almost to the fireside chat, so we'll have a chance to have a conversation. So please go ahead and enter your answer into the poll. Before I move on, does anyone want to comment on these results? Okay.
Hi, I actually have a question regarding
Please.
association. This is Lan.
Yes.
So I find myself that, you know, like in an example where you mentioned, like entering a room and purposefully sit next to somebody who's not Asian, who's not like me. I have done that, but I haven't done that to deny my Asianness. I've done that more of to expose myself to different, potentially different conversation. Most of my friends are Asian, and just because I'm in this area. So I don't know. That's just, I don't feel like I'm covering, but I do that.
So I'm going to talk about this in my next slide. It's called the pinch.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to do something and you get a pinch and you decide not to do it, that's when you're covering. So if you're in a situation and you're doing it to meet someone else, you're not going to feel the pinch. You're just going to say, hey, I want to expose myself to people who are not like me and share about myself. But if you walk over, you feel that pinch, and then you go over, right? That's what we want. We're talking about having freedom, possibly, or at least awareness of the choices we're making.
Right.
And Faye, hi Faye. Oh, yes, please.
And what is the pinch? What is this pinch that you're talking about?
So it's a feeling we have when we want to do something and we go like this, and we're not sure we want to do it anymore. It's your physical awareness that you're making a choice that may not be completely comfortable, and you may deter from making that choice. And somewhere you will feel a pinch. And in the interest of, let me share what I was going to share, just because also I promised Dion I'd end on time so that we could get to our conversation. Faye knows me. Faye knows that I'm just having a little fun. I hope you have some fun with me over this. So the first thing is, if you've never noticed your pinch, start to notice it. You may not experience it right here, but all of us, it's very human, have walked towards something physically or virtually, felt the pinch, and pivoted. By being aware of those moments, that's showing you don't have to do anything. You can. That's showing you where bias exists, because you know that if you do something, it affects how people probably see you, right? So even when I'm driving and I make like a really bad, I'm not paying attention because I'm like doing something, and I do something really rude, I'm like, oh my God, they're going to think I'm a bad Asian driver. I can't help it. It just comes over me, right? So it's one of those moments when you're like, not everyone experiences that. So by being aware of it, that's partly how we're going to create change. Another way to create change as an individual is to tell your story. So when I was selected to serve on the BBC 100, they wanted to interview me and talk about what I call my hyphenation. The moment I realized that I was not just an American, I was a Japanese American. So this is a public story of me talking about my own experience growing up here in Silicon Valley, before it was Silicon Valley. So how often do we reveal that as how we introduce ourselves in a space, or do we save that for friends? Be curious about other stories. I think you've experienced it as much as me, I'm sorry, I couldn't see who you were because I couldn't scroll fast enough. We don't have the same story. We don't have the same pinch. Being curious about others will help deepen our ability to be change agents. And then in terms of advocating, so as the research for Ascend shows, Asians are the least likely to get promoted in organizations. And I think about this Harvard lawsuit, the most interesting argument, I'm not saying for or against, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be political or say I'm for, or I'm not part of it, or that whatever. So I'm just showing it as a demonstration of something. The argument was that it wasn't about accomplishments, it was about personality. And it's that stereotypical Asian personality that has that show up as a detriment. And so bias is often coded in words like personality, when the data shows it can't truly just be personality. So again, I'm not arguing against Harvard at all. I'm just saying, if you look at it as a case study, it's really interesting. Okay, so one is to catch unsupported and stereotypical criticisms of employees, like they don't have the personality to be a leader, and to interrogate it, all right? Advocate in those moments, okay? We know that research from Joan Williams that Asian women are the most likely to experience pushback for being assertive. So when I hear that, I always question, I'm like, okay, so what is the behavior you're talking about? And why is that not considered leader-like? So I'm always willing to speak up about that. Okay. You might hear it in terms of people saying that they lack, again, the stereotype of Asian is not executive presence, that someone lacks executive presence. It's often untrue. How do you get beyond that? One is to notice the pinch and to interrogate it, right? Seen as a task-oriented person, not a big strategic thinker. These are very typical complaints about Asian professionals. Ensure that Asian employees are receiving developmental feedback. So it turns out that our promotability is based about 70% on the challenging assignments we get to increase two things, visibility and skills. If you're noticing that the best assignments are not going to Asian colleagues, that could be a chance to speak up and make sure that they're getting what they need to develop in organizations. And lastly, you can join an employee resource group like an alumni association, like I do the Asian Staff Forum at work, and together learn about each other, feel the pinch, and advocate for change. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing there. And what we wanted to do was have more of a conversation than me just talking. So Dion, let's have our fireside chat.
Thank you, Lori. When I thought about my questions, I had a flood of questions, but in the time we have, I want to limit it to maybe one about options we have as individuals, one as change agents and allies, and one, how can we contribute more fully at the organizational level. So the idea of a pinch moment actually really resonated with me. I thought it was a great description of the kind of visceral and physical reaction that I think I and many have gotten, body tensing, your words kind of get caught in your throat and your mind is racing, a little bit of a fight or flight. And sometimes it takes so much time that the moment's passed and I end up wondering, what could I have said? So wondering if you could maybe give an example, and you can choose one of these two things. I think oftentimes people have heard what it could be a very innocuous question, but where are you from? Where are you really from? And the second question is something I've read about in the news and people have talked about just recently, is what do you do when someone states as a fact or kind of an accusation that Asians are overrepresented in competitive ice skating or STEM fields or higher education? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Adrienne, for reminding us that as we're talking, please put your questions in the chat because we definitely will get to audience Q&A. The other thing I want to say is, there's incredible burnout right now for a lot of folks. So one thing I give myself permission is that I don't always have to speak up. So as you said, Dion, if the moment passed and I just wasn't prepared, it's okay. It's a lot to deal with my own pinch and then all these questions that a lot of other people don't have to deal with. So I just give myself permission. It's okay. Sometimes it goes by. Now, if people, and then again, I always wonder, am I going to expend the energy to have the conversation with somebody who's curious about it, or if I'm not? So let's say I'm going to a diversity, equity, and inclusion event, and there in the context of the room, someone says to me, well, where are you from? And I say, oh, what do you mean, like from Stanford? And they're like, no, where are you really from? And again, we're in a context of having some shared understanding of why we're here, I might just say, oh, what do you mean by that? And if they say, well, I mean, obviously you're not really a Mackenzie, I get that a lot. So you don't have red hair, where are you from? One of the best phrases I ever heard was from a grad student, a PhD, a doctoral student, and they said to me, practice this one. Can I share with you how I experienced that remark? So by asking a question, that person is either going to give you permission or not. You're also not accusing that person in the moment of something if they, let's say, weren't aware. And yet it gives you permission to share how that landed for you. So if we were in the context of DE&I and I said, so what do you mean by that? And they said, well, you're not really a Mackenzie, are you? Like, clearly you don't look like an American. I would say, oh, can I just share with you how I experienced that remark? And then I talk about being the perpetual, right, immigrant in people's minds, and that, well, someone might be curious, perhaps you could save that till you know me as a person better. And then we could see if we have that as a personal conversation, but in absent of a personal connection, it's very othering and you're signaling to me that I don't really belong here, right? So I could share that with somebody. And then if they said, well, I didn't mean it, I could say, okay, well, can I share with you even some research about the impact of these comments, even if the intention doesn't mean anything, there is an impact on people. So, and if you want, I'd be happy to help you further your curiosity in a way that doesn't make people feel like they don't belong, right?
Great. So as you pointed out, we do have choices, and it doesn't have to be calling out someone, although sometimes it is appropriate to be direct. So how can we not only stand up for ourselves, but also other Asian Pacific Islanders or Black, Latinx, and LGBTQ individuals?
Well, I think one thing around Asian professionals is debunking the no problem myth, often with data. So I haven't looked at most recent data, but if you look at Stanford, for example, there are no department chairs who are Asian, even though there are a great deal of Asian professors. That data isn't often discussed or looked at. So I think part of it is having data about your own organization and being able to have conversations about it and what it means, right? So at one point around women, Stanford staff was 70% women, but only about 25% women leaders. So you could see, like, people aren't always aware of that fact. So I have those facts available to have conversations with. Again, not to criticize people necessarily, but to raise awareness so that we can I guess, get real. Now, one of the things I heard from Gloria Steinem, I'll never forget, is that it's better not to compare pain per se, but to say our common system of oppression is what we're all working against. And if we could have our pain unite us, we would get a lot further. So I believe, and I hope others do, that it's my job to know about how racial inequity plays out for everyone, because then I can think about the way the common system is preventing all of us from having this complete expression and freedom, right? So now you could say, well, that seems like a lot of work, but then someone said this quote to me. They said, I wish you would design workplaces with me in mind. And I always thought, gosh, I really wish I could, but I can't unless I know folks as people and context from this. And if I truly believe in inclusion, as a change agent, I have to do that work, because nobody thrives unless everyone thrives, right?
Mm-hmm. So speaking of organizations, what strategies can any one of us take to be a change agent, to facilitate organizations taking actions that will block bias against API and others?
You know, most of the limitation to promotions is personality-based criticisms against folks. So there's kind of the delivery of the result, which again can have bias in that, but there's the how you delivered the result, and the how results are delivered is often where a lot of racial bias plays out, right? So saying, yeah, he delivered great results, but can he really be a great strategic thinker for our organization, right? Or she doesn't really have the presence. She's such a small, like I went to one talk and there were these venture capitalists, and this one woman kept saying, she's so small, look, she looks so young. That's before I had let my gray hair grow out in front of everybody. I was like, what does this have to do with anything? I'm here as an invited guest. Why are you going on and on about me seeming so young and small, right? So most bias exists in the how work gets done. So one way to block it is to hold our organizations accountable for being consistent about what it takes to get promoted, and debunking these myths that someone who looks a certain way or acts a certain way isn't leader-like, because mostly it's against an archetype, a historical archetype. And the second thing is to really make sure you're taking and giving the high visibility assignments that are uncomfortable, but lead to promotions, and making sure that they're given to everyone in the organization, not just the go-to, which tends to be from a very small group of people.
Lori, thank you for sharing those examples and answering my questions. I have a million more questions, but I'd like to give others a chance. And we have a limited amount of time trying to get back on track for Q&A now. And so I'd like to turn it over to Adrian.
Thank you so much, Dion. And thank you to all of you for starting to put questions into the chat. Please keep doing so. We have about 10 minutes now, but after we will have another 10 minutes after the top of the hour. And Lori, thank you so much for the insightful remarks. I really learned a lot in the last 45 minutes or so. I'm going to start with the first question that was put in the chat, which is, could you comment on hyphenated descriptions? So being Chinese American or Filipino American, how does that affect our identities and how others perceive our community?
That's such a great question. And, you know, I think back to what Kenji's work was about, was that, you know, there are differences in where we come from originally and what our backgrounds are. And if a hyphen is a disadvantage, that's what I'm interested in breaking down, not whether or not I'm known as a Japanese American or a middle-aged Japanese American, but that the meaning of that is not perceived by anyone as a disadvantage, and that I could celebrate it. Just like if someone says, I'm just going to use an example. If you remember, like right when we were thinking about immigration in the very early days, there was discrimination against Irish Americans.
Right.
And that today, if someone says, I'm Irish American, there's in most places not a tendency to then say, oh, like you don't belong here. So I'm not sure that it's the hyphen that's the issue. My concern is that the people's meaning of it as less than is what we need to work on, because I will always proudly be Asian, and I would desire to be in places where that's just who I am, not as like something that I have to work against.
I really like that sentiment. It relates to the next question, which is, you know, there are exceptions to every rule, and someone in the chat wanted to get your advice on if she's an Asian manager of a predominantly white team, but that creates its own set of challenges around comfort expressing her culture, talking about her identity. What advice would you give to that person?
That's such a great question. And, you know, I did some work on cohort-based learnings, and we said, never give advice. Because advice is a contract that can break and actually lead to issues. So what you do instead is you tell a story or give an example of how you think about it, but you don't give advice. So if that's okay, I'll just share how I think about it, but this isn't advice. So I love the idea of establishing norms on teams. So the reason why norms are effective for the work I do is it prevents our actions from being individual, and it goes to a collective agreement we have. So if you're the only person on your team, like if I'm the only person who's Asian, and I worked at an institute that was mostly white women, is it up to me to be the only one sharing my racialized story in the United States? Or could we create norms where we share our unique entry points into the conversation and find common grounds and stories? One story of mine is my racialized experience here, but I have many other stories to share. If you make storytelling part of your team dynamics and norms, then you aren't, or I wasn't, like always put up as the one who, okay, Lori, can you share your story of being a racial minority here at the Institute? So I think a lot about norm setting so that everyone's participating, as opposed to me being the sole person butting my head up against what I see.
Lori, I'll ask maybe one more question before I turn things back over to Dion to wrap the main session. And I hope you're ready for tough questions, because this is a complicated one.
Okay.
I think for many of us in the last 18 months, we've all experienced a moment of deep sadness reading something in the news that happened to someone in our community. I think for many people, it was the Atlanta shootings. For me, it was the stabbing of an Asian American woman in New York City several weeks ago. And how do you connect those deeply emotional events with some of the less maybe blunt discrimination that many of us feel day to day in our workplaces? How do they relate to each other? What are the commonalities, and how can we learn from that?
It's a really nuanced and sensitive question to ask. One of the things I always think about is to not cover or pass over what is deeply affecting us, because in many ways that's the motivation for change, right? We often say is that bias thrives, discrimination thrives, harassment thrives in a culture of leniency. So for in cultures where there's a lot of gender discrimination, that's where sexual harassment thrives, because women's voices are diminished versus men's voices. And in a similar way, if you're in a dominant Asian culture, but very few leaders at the top, and nobody's interrogating that, you're in a culture where likely small erosions of confidence in Asian leadership is there. And in those lenient cultures where no one's questioning, no one's asking, no one's trying to solve problems, that's where discrimination thrives, where harassment thrives. So I say, this is, again, not advice. I use those moments for me to remember that the stakes are real. And, I'm 56, I'm not gonna live forever. Like, what am I gonna use my time on earth for? And then to see where I have agency and control is to reduce a culture of leniency where I am and around me. Because then when we all realize that it doesn't have to be that way, but it takes individual action, that's when cultures stop to have less bad behavior, because that permission to act out no longer is the norm in our organization. So every win is a win, and it helps somebody. And I've been helped by others who've spoken up before me. So it's definitely something I think it's valuable to pass along.
It's such a powerful sentiment, Lori, just small steps to reduce the culture of leniency. I know there are more questions. We will have a little bit more time in a couple minutes, but for now, Dion, I'm going to turn things back over to you.
Okay, thanks. There is so much to talk about. And Lori, one of the things that really struck with me is, again, the importance of choice. We have choices, and also we have the right to be perceived and treated as individuals. And that gives us the opportunity to decide how we want to show up. And not every situation, not every person is the same. So I appreciated learning about pinch moments and the importance of recognizing in myself something I could control, my responses, and that covering is limiting, self-limiting. I appreciated the opportunity to hear about the role that curiosity, asking questions, calling in, not just calling out, can be effective. In terms of organizations, the importance of having data so we can talk about what is, and establishing norms on teams. I also heard you say, don't give advice. Others may not want to hear it, but rather we can start from sharing our own personal experiences and telling a story. It's more of a interactive and a give and take. So with that, I do recognize that we're close to the top of the hour. We promised that the main part would end at 6 o'clock, but I'd like to invite everyone to stay for an extended half an hour. As Adrian has said, we'll have the opportunity to discuss a few more questions. And then Lori, you have a breakout group exercise planned that I think will be great. So I'd like to again thank everyone for attending. I hope you'll stay, but we wanted to give just a minute for people to sign off if they cannot. And again, if you have questions, more questions, please put it in the chat so that Adrian can get to those later.
Yeah, I just, as I was listening to what do we do during these pinch moments, and also I wanted to tell a story because it involves actually a couple people here on this call. And early in the pandemic, when the anti-Asian rhetoric was made public and broadcast in the national news, Denise Peck called me up and said, did you see that the Silicon Valley Leadership Group signed a letter within 3 days denouncing the anti-Asian rhetoric? And I said, no. And so I said, I bet there were GSB alums on that letter. And so I looked up all 161 of the names, and I found 5 GSB alums who had signed that letter. And one of them was George Kurian, the CEO of NetApp, and there were others, again. And so it became the organizing element of a 12-session pandemic series. But an early session was allowing all of those GSB alums, not all Asian, but one was George, to tell the story of how they decided to make a stand and sign the letter and what thought process did they go through, whatever. And I just want to say that in addition to these moments, that we have to kind of get over ourselves as individuals, when there's the opportunity to amplify people standing up, by using whatever productive means to do that, I have to believe that being able to tell that story in a platform like this probably open the eyes of people who didn't realize what the impact was, and see what they could have done, no matter who they are. And so I don't know, I just think in addition to learning what to do in a pinch, we also need to learn how to look for those opportunities to have a positive contribution to, turning the light on and having an impact. So again, thanks again, Denise.
Lori, I might build on Julia's comment and ask you to maybe say, just in the work that you do and the people that you know, do you feel like we're in a moment right now where the dialogue is maybe changing? I certainly feel that way, but I've been at this for much less time than you. Like, is there a silver lining in kind of all of the negative news we've read and the experiences we've had?
You know, it's such a great question, Adrienne. And I would say the silver lining is that diversity, equity, inclusion has become a leadership issue, whether leaders want to engage in it or not, through grassroots efforts, through social media, through other means, it is on the table. What's precarious right now is what Sarah Sewell calls as the 3 Bs: backsliding, backlash, and burnout. So the past 2 years have required a tremendous amount of care work for employees who are experiencing the disproportionate impact of what's going on, whether it's unemployed family members, whether it's AAPI hate, whether it's anti-Black hate. We've all leaned in for one another. And so there's burnout, there's backsliding, there's negative things in all our organizations, and there's backlash. So right now we're in a critical moment where either we continue to push this as an organizational imperative, or I worry that it'll become even more fractured and kind of put aside and have us say, let's just focus on return to the office. They're very linked. Who's going to stay in your organization? Who's going to come back to the office? These two belong to these issues belong together. So well, Gloria Steinem calls herself a hopeaholic. I'm a hopeaholic that will seize this moment and continue the pressure, but I'm very realistic that we have a lot of good, hard work ahead of us.
You mentioned burnout, Lori, and I imagine, I'm not going to do this, but I imagine if I did, and I asked, for the 39 of us on this call, how many of us are involved in DEI initiatives at our organization or for our alma mater or whatnot, a large number of hands would go up. And I think a lot about the dual burden that, those of us from underrepresented communities often face in driving these things at our companies, but also living it day to day. What advice do you have on managing through that, and what does it mean to have that dual burden?
I think about the voice of Audre Lorde, who was a Black feminist, gay advocate and poet and writer. And she said that self-care is a matter of self-preservation, and that's radical. So one of the things I think about, I feel guilty when I'm caring for myself, when there's so much work to do. And it's remembering that if we allow ourselves to burn out there, that's not what change looks like. It doesn't look like a bunch of exhausted people lying on the ground at the end of the day, right? So self-care. And then when I think about the fact that we who experience inequality are often the ones who then need to advocate for change. I was talking to Claudia Golden, who's an economist at Harvard Business School, and she's been working on labor economists and change for decades. And I asked her, well, how do you keep doing your work? She not only writes about, she's a mentor to so many rising women academics. And she was like, look, if there's only 2 of us here, if we don't do it, the work doesn't get done. That's just the way it is. And I was like, wow, I love her sentiment that that's just the work there is to do, no emotion about it, and then self-care. So I could argue why it's not fair. I could just say that's the work there's to do right now. I'm intending for it to change. And in the meantime, self-care and care for one another. I think Denise, you said that in the beginning. That's part of what this group is for, to support one another. And I could not do this work without my support system. So.
I'll maybe ask one last question. Lori, something you said maybe 15 minutes ago is still stuck with me, which is this idea of every small step, right, makes a difference. And I guess my question is, for those of us that haven't confronted someone in an elevator yet, or stood up to someone in the subway, or sent an email to the whole company calling out a bad action, what advice do you have for? I guess I'm not going to ask you for advice. Maybe let me rephrase it. What ideas might you have for what that first step might be for all of us as we go on this journey together?
I don't know. I'm not sure that I would start with what feels the most threatening to somebody. That's kind of my sense. And I think it depends on how you see change. I often am asked, like, why don't you work with the leaders who are the worst at this? And I say, you know, there's so much change that needs to be done when you work with leaders who are the worst at this. You spend all your time getting them on board. Even the leaders who are on board aren't doing enough. So I often spend most of my energy, a friend of mine calls it arming the choir, which maybe is a bad metaphor in these times, but arming the choir and pushing forward the people and organizations who have the will, the desire, and the resources to create change, and they need to move forward. You get really far with organizations and leaders who want to create change. And because of the work I do, I've learned how to speak up because my friends have pushed me. I was in a conference and someone did something really just like, I think it was more because I was a woman, but like really turned his back on me and like made sure, because I had a contrary point of view, like made sure that no one could talk to me. And my friend said, you have to talk to him. You have to tell him, this is your job. And I was like, oh. I was like, you're right, I'm at a diversity conference. Okay, if I see him again, I will talk to him. And of course he sits in front of me. So I don't listen to anything that's happening. I'm thinking, I said, I talked to him. Okay, I talked to him. So I pull him aside and I said, can I talk to you? He pushed everyone away. He's like, yes. And I said, can I tell you how I experienced the little working group we're in? And I shared what happened when he moved away from me, and that I had a really hard time expressing my point of view after that. And he actually, a little tear came out. And I realized no one's ever told him. And then he gives me his card. He's like, if you ever need help, here's my card. And I looked, he's like, whoa, he's vice chairman at a really, really big company. Like I had no idea who he was. And the interesting thing, I was teaching in exec ed, and I tell this story, but I never reveal who he was or anything. And someone comes up to me later and said, is this person at this company? I'm like, well, I don't know, like, I'm not saying. And she said, you know what he did? He went to, if it's the same person, but it sounds like it, because it was a very similar story. He went to his executive team and said to the woman, do I do this to you? And they said, yes. So I don't ever tell people they have to speak up, but there's actually work by Carol Dweck and Anita Rattan that shows that if you have a growth mindset and you do speak up, it helps you. Because one, now I don't see him as an evil person. So I now see the world in a much more nuanced way than if I assumed he was evil and didn't speak up. And the second thing it does for you is it makes your loyalty stronger. So now I'm not like, oh, D&I is full of jerks, right? I'm like, oh, we're all in this together. We all have a learning journey, and like someone's going to do that to me sometime, tap me and tell me what a jerk I was. We're all in this together. So I don't advocate ever that you speak up, but the thing I love about their research is it shows it helps you.
Yeah, I love the phrase, can I tell you how I experienced that? That's one that I'm definitely going to try. Lori, we're out of time for questions, and I know we wanted to leave time for the breakout activity. So at this point, I'll turn things back over to you to lead us through that.
Great. So what we thought could be really fun is, because there's so many brilliant people in the room, that you have a chance to talk to one another. So thank you, Kathleen, for putting the questions into chat, which is thinking about, to your point, Adrian, if you've taken steps, what's a bolder step you could take? If you've never taken one, what could you do, and how do you think it'll go, and what support do you need? So when I said that to the person, and I've spoken up since then, I know I can always go to my partner and say, oh my God, because we just have, right? So partly for me to be bold, I have to know that I can share with somebody and they'll just listen. And I know that, and that helps me be bold. So what kind of support do you need to do that? So how long are we going to be in breakout rooms?
I believe it is until 6:26.
Okay,
So we have 13 minutes.
Great thing that they learned. I'm curious if someone would like to share from the breakout room something they would like to try or share a great insight with the rest of us. Oh, please, Joe.
I think we agreed that the act of having this dialogue, especially today, is a transformative act. We come in not knowing, and things are still very fuzzy, but it's very healing in many ways to be in community. And we realize that the more people who are engaged, just our knowledge, even if we're not directly in conversation with them, that it's very strengthening for us. So I thank you very much, really.
Perfect. Thank you for saying that. And I love that you used the word healing, because in many ways, those little cuts we've had leave kind of open sores. And it's really important to give space to the healing so that we have the strength and courage to move on. So thank you so much. Dion, why don't I turn it over to you?
Okay, so we are almost out of time. I think that I would encourage everyone to take some of these ideas. You can think about it and actually put them in action. We don't have to wait for big moments or permission. You can start one step, one person, one conversation at a time, and realizing that you won't always get the perfect result and that it can feel lonely or tiring at times, but we can help each other in the pinch moments and in covering. So I'd like to, again, to thank everyone from coming. And I hope that we can feel more empowered, each of us, to take action, to speak up, to be ourselves, to celebrate who we are. Thank you so much to Lori and the whole team who helped put this together, and to each of you for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming, everybody. The program is formally over. Good night.